Pacific Gender-Based Violence, and Elizabeth Swim from DIA as esteemed speakers. And helping with technology are Swati Narayan and Chloe Wen. A few logistics. You will get a certificate of attendance. The ones who need to receive CEUs, please stay till the end. Please look out for an email from Masterword for the CEUs. You all will receive the recording in a few days once we upload it on the YouTube. We will address all your questions at the end of our presentation. The interpreter holds great power. We ask you to use that power to support clear communication and survivors' autonomy. In doing so, you offer a great powerful gift to the survivor. When you interpret for survivors, for example, you may witness those who have endured the deepest suffering for anyone can know as they relieve their trauma. You are the one who is helping her tell the story in the survivor's language. Their journey, in a sense, inevitably affects your own. What they learn, you learn. And each time you hear survivors share the stories, in some way, you share the healing. Many interpreters for trauma survivors report a sense of fulfillment from working in this field. Doing so, you may also get vicarious trauma, and we will discuss all of these today. Next slide, please. So we have the agenda, and we'll go into the objectives now. So as you look into the objectives, you see that you see in the slide, for all of you to understand the trauma-informed survivor-centered approach, at the same time, implement self-care. So you can, and so next slide, please. So these are the languages that we speak at DIA, created by Elizabeth. It's a wonderful way of expressing how many languages that we speak at DIA. So who are we? What we do? Why it is important to understand domestic violence and sexual assault. So DIA was founded in 1996. It is not an acronym. It is a Sanskrit word meaning compassion. With compassion, we provide services to survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault from the South Asian community. And you can see the map that is just on your left side in Houston and in surviving and beyond. What makes DIA unique is that we provide a culture-specific services. In 2023, last year only, DIA helped 619 clients, ensuring 342 months of rental assistance to 52 families who were safely housed. 301 clients received legal services, including helping with protective order, divorce, custody, and immigration. The trauma-informed counseling were offered by licensed counselors to 428 clients in 13 languages. The Indian American population in USA is growing. Texas is the second largest to hold Indian Americans. And so, Texas, we need interpreter services. DIA services are twofold. Next slide, please. Direct and preventive. Our work is gender neutral. If I use she, please know that I also mean he, and we work with all genders. The direct services include the licensed counseling, as I mentioned, programs geared towards housing, economic empowerment, and legal advocacy. Through our preventive and education outreach program at DIA, we work to inform, actively engage, mobilize, and the community, individuals, and all other institutions in the movement to end domestic violence. Through our preventive program, we also do advocacy at the policy level to impact systems change, impact policies, and which affects the survivors. All our services are trauma-informed and evidence-based. We recognize that trauma is an event, action, or process that leads to a significant negative impact on a person. For example, a survivor who was very eager to obtain the services may rapidly change her attitude and refuse services or may seem withdrawn or resistance. We are very mindful of each survivor's journey to empowerment is different, and we commit to working with each individual at their pace, emotional level that they are at, and according to their needs. Tomiko will now talk about her organization. Tomiko?
Thank you so much, Nasrat. Hello, everyone. My name is Tomiko. I represent the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. We're here collaborating with DAIA on today's training. Thank you so much for having us, DAIA. A little bit about the Institute. We are a national resource center on domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking, and other forms of gender-based violence in the Asian, Asian American, and Pacific Islands, or the acronym AAPI communities. We envision a world that is free of gender-based violence for communities with equal opportunities for all to thrive. And our mission is to disrupt gender-based violence, which causes physical, sexual, emotional, spiritual, and economic harm within AAPI communities throughout the US and territories. A little bit about me. I am part of the language access team with API GBV, and my role is called the Healing Across Languages Senior Project Coordinator. So what that means is that I spend a lot of time talking to interpreters about trauma-informed interpreting, as well as service providers, which is equally important, right? For them to know how to collaborate with us to create a trauma-informed multilingual space. I come from a background of being an interpreter for a little under a decade, and the last few years I did spend with a domestic violence agency based out of Virginia, which is where I am located. And so that's where my perspective comes from. That is the experience that I'm speaking to you on today. All right. And I'll go on. So we're going to be talking about some of the basics around introductions to the domestic violence and sexual assault field. And why are we here? Why is it important for interpreters to be trauma-informed and understand victim services? An interpreter who is not trained in trauma might, right? We're not guaranteeing, we're trying to stereotype our interpreters, but we might be tempted to maybe not understand emotional displays, or maybe get irritated when someone cries or raises their voice, acts upset or angry, or maybe even is non-responsive, right? The responses can range from being upset and crying to maybe being unresponsive and freezing, right? The person might change their story or speak very quietly or be incoherent when they are speaking, right? And we might not understand those things if we are not trained in the elements of trauma. We might then think negatively about the victim for their manner. And we might not understand some of the nonverbal cues and believe that maybe this person is lying. And we might deny the believer. We might deny the survivor and not believe what they are saying, and maybe think these awful things, this could never happen to someone, right? Or we might try to clean up the person's language. We might suppress curse words or clean up graphic information. We might even misunderstand a professional's comments, right? We're going to be talking to Elizabeth today about kind of her approach to talking about what is happening to the survivor, them through the process, but we might not really understand what someone like Elizabeth is kind of thinking as they're approaching her questions, her responses to questions, and maybe think they're inappropriate, they're intrusive, repetitive, or maybe it insults the LEP or the limited English proficient person. But there is a logic to what she's doing because she is trained in how to handle those situations. And then we might try to take control of the conversation because we are the person who speaks both languages. And we might try to answer questions for the client or answer questions for the professional. And then we interrupt and intervene the process that the professional is there to help on, right? And we are here talking about interpretation. You all are trained interpreters. You have gone through interpretation training, not necessarily advocacy training, psychology training, etc. Right? Although it really does help to know what those topics or professions are doing as they are going about their role, right? And so we want to help you prepare psychologically to handle those emotionally charged sessions, to avoid judging survivors We want to reduce the inclination to cross role boundaries and help your ability to interpret without emotional distress, which does slow us down. We also want to prevent unconscious body language, which might show other people uncomfortable. And we also really want to emphasize the importance of reducing or preventing vicarious trauma, because at the end of the day, we're here to enable communicative autonomy for the survivor. And we will dive further into that subject later today. And so thank you so much for having me. We are going to move on into domestic violence, sexual assault, the basics of it. Nusrat is going to talk to us about that. And then we're going to pass the mic on to Elizabeth to talk to us about her approach in advocacy and hotline services. Nusrat?
Thank you. So this segment talks about your important role in understanding the domestic violence and sexual assault and be a part of the survivor's journey to healing. So what is domestic violence? If you look at the slide, it is all about power and control. It is defined as a behavior, a pattern of behavior in any relationship that is used to gain or maintain power and control over an intimate partner. And this power and control can be manifested in different ways: intimidation, threat, coercion, etc. Next slide, please. So if you look at this slide, you can see there's so many ways that this manifestation can be shown in the physical, in emotional, sexual, economic, spiritual, psychological. And for the sake of the time, I'm just going to give a few examples. For example, emotional, psychological abuse can be threatening suicide or harm to self, intense jealousy, suspicion, insults, criticism, sarcasm, or accusation for not doing a thing correctly. Spiritual abuse, for example, can be using the partner's religious or spiritual beliefs to manipulate them. Next slide, please. So look at this slide. Domestic violence, as we said, is all about power and control. But this slide, just like Duluth Power and Control Wheel, talks more about the immigrant power and control wheel. And today we are talking about survivors of color, immigrants. So we are using this to make us understand what barriers that the immigrants face, the additional barriers that the immigrants face. If you look at this power and control wheel, you see that hiding or destroying important papers, threatening to report the survivor to ICE to get her deported, threatening to report her if she works under the table, not letting her to getting a job or schooling, lying about her immigration status, withdrawing or threatening to withdraw papers filed for her residency, isolating her from friends and family or anyone who speaks a language, threatening to take her children away from her from USA, all become additional barriers of power and control on top of the regular, the isolation or the intimidation that she already or he already faces. Next slide, please. So at DAIA, we created bridging a cultural divide. If you look at this wheel, you will notice that it is similar to the Duluth Power and Control wheel, like this: isolation, intimidation, economic abuse, etc. But it has its own cultural divide. For example, perpetrators often exploit the victim's lack of immigration status as a tactic of abuse, maintaining that power and control by reinforcing fears of deportation. As we said, like many DAIA clients, visa are dependent on the aid, and abusers find it dependent on abusers, and they find it in some cases that they don't have work authorization, like H-4 visa holders. And then if their finances are totally controlled by the abusers, imagine their situation. Fear of losing status keep them captive in the relationship, more so if they have US-born children. Research shows that the immigrant survivors suffer more severe abuse and more often. Nearly 75% of the abused undocumented women in one survey said that their spouse had never filed for their papers. 65% of the immigrant survivors of abuse interviewed reported that the abusers had threatened for deportation. So if you look at all the statistics and look at the wheel, you can see how the barriers are going up and up. So if you look at the lack of trust, immigrants hold a mindset from home country that they come from about the legal system and don't trust the police or any other formal systems outside of the family. So just think about that H-4 visa holder who's dependent on the spouse, does not call the police for the assault that she has faced, may not be eligible to apply under the U visa. And if she files for divorce, she's out of status, needs to leave the country. What happens to her children? If you look at the transnational abandonment, which is another unique barrier that survivors of color face, where a victim is by coercive means taken to the home country and left there without the immigration documents, abusers return to the USA, files for the divorce, getting a default judgment on the custody. Or they are married to a person living abroad who goes on honeymoons, leaves the victim, but never brings them to the USA. We see these type of clients that need our help, and we help them to come back to USA to gain the custody and help with the immigration. The other unique abuses that we see in our clients is in-law abuse and religious abuse. That religion texts are taken out of the context to maintain the abuse and to justify the abuse. Next slide, please. So the American system is adversarial and very formal. The courts here are working under court rules that are extremely stringent. The process is more important than a person. And with parties appearing under the American system, they are just a number. And very often, they do not even feel heard or seen. Moreover, immigrants are not aware of the jury system, and then they don't understand why they would be speaking about their journey in front of all the strangers. That is where Daya comes in as a unique agency, providing cultural-specific services and speaking in their native language, helping clients understand and navigate this complex legal system. If you look at the slide, you can imagine that even in a normal day situation for a survivor, calling 911 gets all the systems and relief is not a very easy task. Making that 911 call or someone else doing it for her, it can bring a room full of people into her life, all with good intentions, all working under the rules and process. And interpreters are one more added person in this room full of people. Your services is so important when the survivor needs your help to tell his or her story. If the interpreters are trauma-informed and understand the confidentiality, it strengthens the system's approach. Survivors also feel confident. Understanding information sharing and importance of confidentiality protection between the system or entities such as interpreters are necessary conditions. Next slide, please. So imagine now, for a survivor of color who are going through so much of the abuse and have these additional barriers. You can just think, how do they respond? How do they react when they're exposed to this complex alien system and they don't know how to react and how to act? They become silent or goes into a survival mode. Here we need to understand why culture is so important, why culture is a fact. If our goal is to ensure that victims are able to make the best decisions for the best outcomes in their attempts to live a violence-free life. It is important to understand how culture shapes an individual's experience of violence, how they're restrained by that invisible chain of norms and traditions, and whether in their culture perpetrators accept responsibility, whether culturally services are equally accessible. It is important that we also understand our responses and biases. Culture is extremely important component of human life. Culture here refers to all the factors that characterizes specific groups. If you remember the map of the South Asian countries, you may think that we all come from the same culture. In reality, we are not homogeneous population. Mostly we hear when you talk about South Asia, people think that we are from India. While I'm a Muslim from Bangladesh, I may have a unique value different from Muslims in India or Pakistan, while Muslims worship mosques, Hindus, temples, and so on. Keeping all this perspective in mind, we see that coming from a culture of collectivism, survivors often minimize their abuse. They don't respond to the harm. The familiar harm that they are going through becomes a better choice for them to making the change. One of the survivors in a report stated, letting go of that dream and accepting it wasn't my reality with this partner was incredibly difficult. External pressures like religion and the shame of a failed marriage weighed heavily on me. I am a type A. I do not handle unplanned events as well. And I'm not being able to fix this relationship was a bitter pill to swallow. Next slide, please. So language is power. It is not only just about communication. It is a powerful tool that can shape the perceptions and experiences, especially in the domestic violence and sexual assault cases. As we stated, all ethnic groups have cultural identities and gender norms, and there are strengths. The cultures have the strength. It contains a rich history of the people that include traditions, struggles, achievement, triumphs. And culture nourishes the pride and the resilience of belonging. And the intersectional identities are important to understand, but there can be harms as well. Domestic violence can be equated with obedience, and internalized intergenerational oppression can normalize the abuse. Dismantling these deeply ingrained norms can be extremely difficult. Cultures prescribe and maintain traditional patriarchal gender norms and roles. Transgression from these norms can bring harm. The boundaries of what is and isn't culturally acceptable, enforcing compliance by violence, rejection, fear, or even death by 1,000 perpetrators, like several minor setbacks, which can ultimately result in significant harm. For example, a Daya client in a DV situation when there was physical abuse, she defended herself, but she refrained from calling the police, thinking of the harm the family reputation can be put up to. Whereas the husband made the first police call against her, the client gets arrested. When the interpretation is done well, and you can become an instrument of healing and justice, emotions can be crucial. They share what happens to them. You bear the witnesses to the survivor stories. You tell exactly what they said instead of thinking you need to abide by the cultural nuances. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that was created by API-GBV. And we refer this slide because we want you to understand. And if you look at the spiral, you see that from infant, child, teenager, adult, and elder, all throughout the life cycle, there are different types of abuse that may happen. Keep that in mind while you are interpreting that abuse can happen at any stage of an individual. Next slide, please. So when we are talking about the language and the impact of victimization, we have to understand the victim's ability to express the experiences and the perceptions that others hold, and the cultures by others, and what can be the legal outcome as well, right? For survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, providing accurate interpretation without the interpreter's emotional involvement, judgment, or interference is crucial. By stepping out of your role as interpreter, you may damage the process of recovery or the survivor's access to justice. For example, in a recent Daya case, we saw misinterpretation of two key statements. One misinterpretation was, he's going to take my children to X country and kill me, versus he's going to take us to the X country. And the second interpretation was, he has another wife versus he wants to have another wife. These can have an impact on the legal outcome. In the other case, there was a discrepancy between the statement by the DS office, who took an interpreter line, and the sheriff's office, who used a friend of the victim who did not disclose the sexual abuse due to cultural stigma. Stigma of rape and sexual abuse resulted in being denied the protective order. Imagine how the interpretation caused the client of her safety not getting the protective order. So you have the power. I will now pass on to Elizabeth to speak about her experience working with interpreters at Daya. Elizabeth?
Thank you so much, Nusrat and Tomiko, and I want to thank Swati and Chloe as well. You'll see here on this slide that I'm in a community of people today that's just a small part of the community that have helped me prepare the few materials that I'll share with you today. I am Elizabeth Swim. I am a fourth generation immigrant, and I participate in the Punjabi Sikh community here in Houston, and I am Daya's first helpline client advocate. I've been here since November 2021. And while I've created this role, I've had a wide variety of experiences that span a spectrum of wonderful interactions with language access service providers like yourselves, as well as, like Nusrat mentioned earlier, kind of having to sort of make do with whatever is available, which doesn't always have the best results. So if you can imagine that, as Nusrat, Dr. Amin was saying earlier, that there are people who whose help and support are limited after they've already been working with us for a while, that their help and support and their legal remedies are limited by the kind of interpretation that's provided. Imagine on a helpline call what can happen if there is an interpretation service that somehow marginalizes the survivor and doesn't put them at the center and doesn't make them feel like they want to stay on the phone and call us again when they need support. So that's how high the stakes are. And we're really glad that you're here with us today to learn more about this. So I want to just start with talking about what we generally tend to do on a crisis intervention call. We validate the survivor, we listen to them, we make as much time and space as possible to witness the survivor as they process what they've been through. We know through psychological and educational research that people learn more and more deeply from listening to themselves talk than they do from hearing someone else talk. So that's one of the reasons that I really do make as much space for clients to talk, for callers to talk during our calls. And then we're also practicing safety planning. We are doing harm reduction. We are planning as much as possible to reduce the harm that a survivor might experience. And I want to highlight here one of my mentors, Thesia Jenkins at the Harris County Domestic Violence Coordinating Council, says this all the time. The person with the most control over a survivor's safety is the person or are the people doing harm, right? So there's only so much I can do. There's only so much you can do as an interpreter. But when we do our best to adhere to interpreter ethics, like, simply translating the message, not adding any meaning, and also facilitating a conversation as opposed to taking control of it. Those are things that can help a caller, help a survivor trust the call, build rapport, and feel like they want to call us back again when they need help in the future. The other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the ways that survivors have been harmed have been based in communication and have been based in taking their voice away, right? And Tomiko said earlier that it's our job to, let's see, I put it in the chat. It was this great mic drop quote. But basically, we are here to enable communicative autonomy for the survivor, right? And so if a survivor has been shut down, has been gaslit, has been brainwashed by a person or by people who are doing them harm, they haven't had a voice, right? And so getting on a helpline call and talking to me in their mother tongue, if they are able to say, I have this experience, I feel this way, and the interpreter then interprets that through as, I feel this way, even if the survivor isn't comfortable functioning in the shared language with me on the call, they might still understand that it's their voice is getting translated literally. I feel this way. I am here. This is my experience, right? Their literal first person voice is getting carried through. And when we don't use, first and second person pronouns according to interpreter ethics, when we talk about someone in third person, like many people might be used to doing, especially if they are elders in their sibling lineups or in other contexts where they're advocating on behalf of other family members. If we talk about someone in the third person between the interpreter and the advocate, there's not that same felt sense of autonomy for the caller, the client, the survivor, as if their first person I statements get translated through true to meaning all the way to me as an advocate. I have a lot to say. I could talk forever, and I'm going to try to keep my remarks to our allotted time. But if there's one thing that you leave with today, sorry, can we actually go forward, Tomiko, to the rocking horse and Ferris wheel slide? Just slide 30. And we'll go back. If there's one thing that you leave with today, from my remarks, I hope it's that if you ever feel overwhelmed in talking with a survivor and interpreting for a survivor, that's completely healthy. It's a standard experience. Even we advocates can feel overwhelmed, and we can sometimes miss things, and we can sometimes feel like a call is moving simultaneously, as you see on the left, as slow as a Ferris wheel, kind of approaching and leaving the main target of discussion, and simultaneously as fast as a rocking horse, where we're not actually getting all the information, and we might need to ask for clarification. And I'm seeing something come through in the chat. Some interpreters do switch to third person in overly traumatic descriptions. And this is mentioned in ethics, especially if they have shared or similar experiences to the person they are interpreting for in order to prevent vicarious trauma. And I'm going to definitely defer to Tomiko on that. I feel like that's a really valid point, and I'm so glad that you brought that up, Ashley. So let's go back. I appreciate your flexibility with me in the slides. Let's go back to slide number 22. And we've got some sort of guidelines that I try to follow during a helpline call. So we generally, like I said, we make as much space as possible for a caller or a survivor. We ask open-ended questions. So I might ask really short open-ended questions and then be ready for the caller or the survivor to talk for quite a while. I'm ready to repeat myself. If I've provided information, but I get a sense that a caller or survivor is intensely in the moment of telling their story, I'm ready to repeat the information and even share it in multiple ways. I might be texting or emailing things over. And that's where your clear interpretation of email addresses and name spellings comes through, is really, really important. As much as possible, I invite a simple choice between two options. If I can distill something down, would you like me to email you or text you as an example? I ask permission as much as I can. So here in this webinar, that would look like I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we face on crisis calls, the specific phrases that you might hear from me, some things to avoid, and some things to keep in mind when considering trauma and working with clients. Is that okay? Or I'm going to talk a little bit more about my experience, and then at the end of the webinar, you'll have a chance to ask all the questions that remain. Is that okay? That's an example of me asking permission. I hope I'm speaking clearly right now. I hope I'm leaving breaks between words, and I actually have a buddy here who will let me know if I'm not. Leaving breaks between words is really important when dealing with people who might have traumatic brain injury or head injury, or people who are really intensely involved with the stress of trauma, because that can affect auditory processing. And I don't know if you've ever had the experience of trying to understand someone who is talking faster than you're comfortable with. I have this experience quite often, and I might miss breaks between words and think that two words are one, and so forth. So this is a lovely way that we can be accessible to survivors, whether they're English language learners or people who are involved with disabilities and the stress of trauma. During a crisis call, an open-ended question, let's go on to the next slide. An open-ended question will get the most needed data and build the most rapport at the same time. So if I have my intake form and it has 20 questions on it, if I go through each question, I might keep the survivor on the phone with me for the first 5 questions or the first 2 questions, and then I might lose them because they might not be here to answer all my questions. They might need to vent instead. They might need to hear themselves talk through what they've been through. This might be the first time someone has ever spoken with a trained stranger about the ordeal that they've been through. And we center the caller, the survivor. We center them by believing them and by gathering the data that they feel comfortable sharing, by obviously maintaining confidentiality, which is really, really important. Let's go on to the next slide. And we trust the survivor to talk about what is most important for them. We may need to prompt them with something like, what does safety mean to you? What is your main concern? There's times when survivors might go on and want to tell everything in detail from 3 years ago up until now, month by month. And at a certain point, we recognize as advocates, we have a limited amount of time in the call, so we might need to redirect. So we might interrupt and we might ask, what does safety mean to you? What's your main concern? What keeps you up at night? How do you want things to be different? And if someone seems really distressed and we want to support them to connect with resources that are available, we might say, who in your life is on your side? Obviously asking as well, if sometimes we just need to ask what is going on, and that's enough to get a caller or a survivor talking. Let's go on to the next slide. So we are as okay as we can be with incomplete information. The client relationship is more important. This is not like other interpreting scenarios or services where if you're doing a customer service call or you're in a doctor's appointment or you're doing something else that's bound to that call, where you might actually be able to address the problem that the client is bringing in that particular service. This is not like that. This is an initial approach and an opportunity to earn a caller, a survivor's trust. Let's go on to the next slide. And we want to support the survivor to feel safe calling us even when they don't have all the access to all of their life skills because maybe they've been through a head injury or they've had a lot of stress and trauma involvement. And we want a caller or a survivor, ideally, to feel comfortable calling us, even when they don't remember that they've already called us before, but they don't have a bad enough memory to not call us, or when they don't know if we can actually help them with their specific goal. We still want to keep the relationship intact because we can provide referrals if we can't directly address their challenge. So now let's, so basically I want you to remember, if you haven't already been trained in trauma, and Tomiko will get into this more, that next slide, please. It might be really challenging to communicate with a survivor or a caller who is involved with trauma and stress and head injury. And if you feel overwhelmed with that, that's okay. Any advocate in shared language with the client would probably feel overwhelmed as well. This is not about a deficiency in your skills or in an advocate's skills. This is about a situation that's bigger than any of us and that we need to approach step by step by step. A client might not give direct answers to the advocate's questions while you're interpreting, but that's okay. It's still your job to simply interpret across whatever it is the client is responding to the questions that are being asked. Let's go on to the next slide. So we as advocates, we ask open-ended questions as often as possible. We listen for safety concerns. We listen for negative self-talk and self-blame that a client may be practicing. And we do our best to intervene and offer reframes for that, positive reframes. And let's go on to the next slide. So we might toggle back and forth between safety planning, which we've already discussed, and abuse education, which is where we kind of reframe, okay, this isn't your fault. This is, this situation is based on choices that the person harming you or the people harming you made, right? You didn't make those choices. Is it possible that you didn't have control over this? What would happen if you thought about the possibility that this isn't your fault? And a lot of times our clients and callers have basically been brainwashed to believe that all of the ordeals that they've been through are their fault. And that's one of the very deep, pervasive, lasting effects of abuse, emotional abuse, any kind of abuse. So a lot of times before we can kind of even get to the abuse education or safety planning phase, a client might need to vent for a while. And that's okay. We're going to go to the next slide. So you'll remember this slide from earlier. It might feel like this when a client is venting, because sometimes clients can kind of approach and go away from and then approach again sort of the core issue, but sometimes by giving a very specific timeline, a detailed timeline of every single little thing that's happened. And even though we may not as advocates need to know all of the details, it might be really important for a client or survivor to convey those, because this may be the first time that they're verbalizing them to anybody out loud. And so even though there might be a lot of words coming from a client or a caller, and then our questions might be small and short and slow, and the rhythm might get a little bit uneven and might feel like there's a stilted rhythm to the call for you as an interpreter. This is all part of our methodology. So again, like the problem of abuse is way bigger than any of us can address in one call, even a week or a month of calls. Sometimes it can take years for people to recover, decades even. So what we want to do is we want to be like the person at a party or at a class or anywhere else where you go where you've never been. We want to be the greeter who welcomes you and makes sure you know where you need to go, right? At the beginning of this call, we had some introductions in the opening statements. We had some notes in the chat about when we were going to get started. And hopefully that made you feel a little bit more comfortable being in this totally new space. So that's really what we want to do with our clients, with our callers, with our survivors, is support them to feel as comfortable as possible, knowing that they're probably not safe, but as welcome as possible and as open to sharing as possible, as open to sharing with us as possible. And we do that by using our empathy, using our emotional intelligence. And when we do that, it may feel as dizzying as this slide shows. So we'll go to the next slide. This is far from a linear process, as I mentioned before, and probably need to repeat the process of kind of going through abuse education, safety planning over and over and over again with a client. We do this over months, and as I said before, even years of working with someone at Daya. And basically, as I said earlier, if you're missing things as an interpreter, it's likely that an advocate in the same shared language would miss those things too. And we would love it if you would ask the client for clarification when you're missing things. Ask us for clarification when you're confused about what we're saying as advocates. That not only helps us trust the process of interpreting, it helps the client know that you're listening, and it helps the client trust the whole process, trust us more, trust interpreters in general. It's okay to say that you missed something and that you don't know. And let's go to the next slide. I just wanted to leave this slide up here. These are some of the things we say as often as we can to validate and encourage survivors. I love to end on the big phrase here on the right: even though things can never go back to the way they were, life can get better. And of course, we often say, I believe you, it's not your fault, and you are not alone. So we're going to go on. I believe Tomiko is going to take us through specifics about interpretation in domestic abuse and sexual assault settings.
Okay, thank you so much, Nusrat and Elizabeth. I know personally, I just learned so much. I keep learning so much from you all as advocates, as professionals in this field. I keep learning more and more as an interpreter, as someone in my position. So really, thank you so much for filling in this information. We're making really beautiful timing. We did just go over a lot of information, so we want to make sure that we give you all a little break. We're going to go into break for about 5 minutes. I'll put a timer up on the screen. And once those 5 minutes are over, we're going to return and we'll start with some information around interpretation in the DBSA setting. Okay. All right, so I'm going to put the timer up on the screen. I hope you guys can take care of yourselves in those 5 minutes. All right, see you soon.
Finishing my studio, how I like spending the day and staying out all night. And I'm bored of being bored, craving something more. Broke as hell, heaven is a setting I haven't been. Traveling, taking in serotonin shots, I got to try everything. Falling in love on a rooftop, soul searching, and it don't
Stop.
Friends with a deep conversation, sharing our secrets, cutting my hair. Learning a foreign language, como se dice, take me there. I wanna go far away where nobody knows my name. Nothing to prove, nothing to lose. Starting over, starting new anywhere but here. Swear to God, these people keep testing me. One way ticket to LA, Mumbai, Guantanamo Bay, Santorini, Saint-Tropez, Amazon, Appalachian, Bermuda, Beijing, Boston. Give me a movie cliche. I wanna go far away where nobody knows my name. Nothing to prove, nothing to lose.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. We are at the 1 hour mark. We're just wrapping up our first break. We just went over some of the basics of DV and SA in the communities that DIA works with. Also can be applied to many other communities. Elizabeth also just talked to us about the way that she approaches crisis calls, which a lot of you all do interpret for or might anticipate interpreting for, or hopefully that information is applicable to other sessions or appointments or calls that you all are asked to interpret for. I do see several questions in the chat, and I also see hands raised, and I'm really happy to see you all are very engaged, have a lot to say, have a lot to share and to ask. Hopefully we do address your questions by the end of today's session, where we will have a Q&A, but please do drop your questions in the Q&A chat box so that we can address them at the end. Okay, and I do believe we had mentioned that CEU information will be provided at the end of the presentation, at the end of this training. And so stick around for that. And these slides will be provided to you at the end of the training as well. So you will have access to this information as well as the recording as well. Okay, and so I'll go on now. We have a lot of information to go over. By no means do we feel like you all have the obligation to be completely trauma informed at the end of this webinar, that you all should know everything there is to know about trauma informed interpretation, trauma informed services, but this really is just the beginning, right? So we do have a lot of information to go over. As interpreters working in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault, we often find ourselves working with conversations where survivors recount their traumatic experiences in detail. And this process requires us to navigate a complex array of factors that can significantly impact communication. So today we want to delve into those critical elements and explore how they influence our role as interpreters. So first, I do like to start off with definitions. We are here as agents of language access, as proponents of language access. And by definition, language access says, right, this is one definition of many, but generally when we say language access, we mean to say that limited English proficient individuals and or deaf or hard of hearing individuals should be able to access information, programs, and services at a level equal to English speaking and hearing individuals in a timely manner. So I really like this definition, and there are many out there, like I said, but this definition really helps us to think about, would this be happening if everybody here spoke the same language? Right. I like to ask this to service providers. I also like to ask this to interpreters. At any moment, we can ask ourselves this question: would this be happening? And if the answer is no, a child would not be interpreting for this conversation. No, there wouldn't be this stranger who is now participating in this conversation, speaking on behalf of the survivor. No, the neighbor would not be, filling in gaps or speaking on behalf of somebody, right? If the answer is no, that would be actually very inappropriate, or no, actually that would not be happening if everybody here spoke the same language, then likely something needs to change, right? And so a lot of trauma-informed interpretation is really based on really sticking to our interpreter role, right? The definition of the interpreter's role, one of many, right, is that interpreters use spoken or sign language to relay a message from one language into another without adding, deleting, or changing the content or intent of the message, right? So this is very basic for a lot of the folks who are in the room who are trained, qualified interpreters, right? A lot of what interpretation in a trauma-informed practice is defined by what we are not, right? We are there to provide one role and one role only. And so I want to put a poll up on the screen right now, just to get a feel, right, for what we all think interpretation training is for. What is the interpreter's role, right? Is it also advocacy? Are we here talking about advocacy? Are we here talking about how to do a cultural consultation? Are we here talking about how to provide emotional support? How to provide mediation summaries, right? When one goes through interpretation training, are we talking about providing these things, right, in our role? So I'll keep this up on the screen for a little bit. I do see numbers going up and down. All right.
5 more seconds.
Okay, thank you. 5 more seconds. All right, I think we can go ahead. So I am relieved to see that 50% more or less said that interpretation is none of the above. And that is correct. The interpreter's role is not that of an advocate. It is not that of a cultural consultant. We are not there for emotional support or for summarization. As Elizabeth beautifully put, right? She has her own training, her own expertise on how to handle a call, right? It might be necessary for someone to be able to play both roles, that of an advocate, that of an interpreter, out of necessity, right? But it is impossible to play both roles at once. And we also prefer that they be really played by 2 different people. Interpreters come in with a very specific skill set. It requires a lot of cognitive skills, a lot of parameters and training around that skill set, right? We are not here for advocacy, right? That is what Elizabeth beautifully can do, right? I, Tomiko, am trained in interpretation, but Elizabeth and I, the advocate and the interpreter, are a dream team. We complement each other, but we do have distinct roles. We have the same objectives, which is to help stabilize the person in danger, to get them to safety, to empower them. We have those same goals, but we do it as interpreters through interpretation and not by getting involved in the conversation, not by advocating for them. And advocates help one make decisions. Interpreters, when we make a decision on someone's behalf, we take that away from them. And this is very serious when we're talking about the power and control wheel, the fact that folks have maybe been subject to silence, etc. Right? And we have a lot more to say about this. But really, I want to emphasize that interpretation is not advocacy. We're also not anthropologists. We are not there for cultural consultation. We'll have a whole section talking about this as well. We are not there for emotional support. We are likely going to say the wrong thing or cause re-traumatization or maybe create dependency on the interpreter, which ultimately in the long run is harmful. and might actually jeopardize the services that are being given to the survivor, right? Although this is something that we might have the desire to do because we want to help. Of course, this is very normal, but there are jobs or job titles such as that of an advocate where we do help make decisions and we provide that emotional support, but that is not what we do when we take on the interpreter role, right? And we also do not summarize. We do not mediate or summarize conversations. That is not what an interpreter does, right? We interpret messages accurately, completely, without editing or adding to the message, right? That is our role, and that is hard enough, right? And when we summarize a conversation or we summarize a message, we by definition are deciding what is important to say or what is important to hear on behalf of the speaker. And as interpreters, we are decision makers. We make decisions about word choice and judgment calls, but we want to honor the survivor's decision to speak up despite everything that they have gone through, the risks that they take in speaking up, right? As Nusrat and Elizabeth have really beautifully put before this, right? It takes a lot for a survivor to get to that point, and it is very critical that the survivor be able to make informed decisions and be fully a part of the conversation, right? We are helping by just interpreting. Interpretation, when done right and when done in a trauma-informed manner, enables equitable communication as well, which is something that kind of complements the communicative autonomy that I had mentioned earlier. Equitable communication is a model of communication in which everyone impacted by an issue has the right to participate in addressing it. It does not matter what language we speak, we are all experts, and the survivor is the expert on their own experience, their own culture, etc. Everyone plays a role in supporting good communication. A lot of folks will think, oh, well, there's an interpreter here, or oh, this document is translated, and so this is language access, this is language accessible, and that is not the case. It is also everybody's responsibility, even those who speak English or those who speak multiple languages, to make sure that interpretation is happening correctly and that the multilingual space is done in an equitable communication model, right? Everyone's perspective matters regardless of language. We want to ensure all parties have equal access to information. We want to facilitate participation from everybody impacted by the issue. And in fact, we want to center the person who's been impacted by the issue. And everyone should receive the same information. We recognize that every perspective matters in the communication process. So this is one of the decision-making pillars for interpreters. When we have those judgment calls to make, we can lean on one of these decision-making pillars, which is equitable communication. We also want to think about our role as the interpreter, right? We also have our interpreter ethics, which I'll go into in just a second. This is something that we're all trained on as trained interpreters. You have a code of ethics depending on the field that you're in, although they vary a little bit. We're going to be talking about guiding principles for interpreters outside of the courtroom in the DVSA setting. Right. And we also have our healing-centered practices, right? We talk a lot about trauma and triggers, but we also want to think about healing, and we want to think about practices that promote the healing of everybody involved. Okay, and so like I had mentioned, our interpreter code of ethics are going to be one of our decision-making pillars, right? They're going to back us up when we want to make a decision or when we have to make a decision. And maybe it's not something that you in your day-to-day life would make, right? The interpreter role is not necessarily a very natural dynamic. It asks us to be very neutral and impartial, and that is not necessarily something that you might instinctually do on a day-to-day basis if met with a situation that is really emotionally charged or just really hard, right? And so as interpreters, we have guiding principles for interpreters working outside of the courtroom in the DVSA setting. So this is kind of something that we like to complement our code of ethics with at API-GBV in talking about trauma-informed interpretation, working with survivors of violence, right? And I will dive further into this as we go forward, but everything that we're talking about today is going to allude to each of these canons, right? That we have a duty to accuracy, integrity, impartiality, etc. We also have our core elements of trauma-informed or healing-centered approach. And again, there are many versions of the trauma-informed approach out there. And we at API-GBV, we like to talk about safety, empowerment, choice, and agency, being informed by an understanding of the effects of healing and trauma, communicative autonomy and equitable communication as elements of our trauma-informed practice. And again, we will be diving further into this as we go forward. And everything really that we talk about today is going to allude to these elements. And so we cannot talk about trauma-informed practices without, right, defining trauma. And so just for the sake of time, I will define trauma really quickly. There are many ways to talk about trauma, many definitions of trauma out there, is true for a lot of the concepts that we've discussed today already. But trauma is often talked about in the 3 E's. It is an event, series of events, or circumstances that is experienced, second E, by an individual as physical or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects. And a lot of what is talked about with trauma is that it is a very individual experience, right? One person might not necessarily feel the lasting adverse effects of trauma for the same experience that someone else does, right? So one person might find that that experience was traumatic, while another person maybe does not necessarily feel that way, right? And trauma is going to be one of the things that impact communication. As interpreters, we're intimately working with someone's message, the way that they talk. And trauma is definitely one of those things that is going to impact communication. And we have all interpreted for people with trauma. Trauma is very prevalent. The difference here is that we are interpreting for conversations that are directly addressing sources of trauma between clients and their providers. And even if we set a professional boundary and say, listen, I'm not really comfortable interpreting for cases that have to do with child sexual abuse, there is no guarantee that we will not come across them. But we are here to address how interpreters can prepare for when you interpret for victim services agencies such as DIA. And we cannot talk about trauma without talking about the brain. And just for the sake of time, I will kind of summarize this video, which you do have access to in your slides. I do highly recommend that you check it out. It's a really great short video that kind of breaks down what is happening in the brain as one experiences trauma, and then what is happening in the brain during those long-term adverse effects of trauma as well. And so what I think is important to note about this video or about this phenomenon is that trauma will affect memory. As one is experiencing a traumatic event, the hippocampus goes offline, and that's just a fancy way of saying that's the part of the brain that stores away memories. And our amygdala, which is our fight or flight part of our brain, right? I'm not a neuroscientist, forgive me if I'm really generalizing this, but the fight or flight part of our brain goes on. And then our frontal lobe, which is kind of the part of the brain that helps us think about context, that helps us do logic or reasoning type tasks, goes offline because we're trying to focus on surviving, right? And a lot of folks have different responses to trauma. I'm sure you all are very aware of this: the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And so the impact on our memory, right? And on bringing those things up back in the body, which is what happens when maybe we are triggered. Those things are going to impact the way that someone can tell their story. And people like Elizabeth, or people who work with survivors and try to get us a clear story of what's happening here, right? What are the circumstances this person is navigating, or that they are navigating? It might be hard for someone to tell a nice linear story that is detailed and chronological for more than one reason. One of those reasons is going to be memory. And trauma-informed service providers are going to be very aware of that in talking to a survivor. And interpreters should be well aware of that as well, and be ready to be in conversations or interpret conversations where the service provider is working through that, right? Elizabeth really beautifully put, right, that we might not have complete information all at once. And that's something that she is ready for, and the interpreter should be as well. And just a note, just a heads up about this video before I move on, there are mentions of violence and sexual assault, and the narration and the characters in it do have, I think, an Irish accent, so just be prepared to hear that. I do see a few things in the chat. I'm just going to check really quickly. I think we're good. Okay. And some examples of topics that you might be interpreting for in victim services. You might be dealing with a conversation that has to do with child physical or sexual abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking. Maybe you're working with survivors of homicide and some of the psychological impacts of trauma, right? We might experience fear, anxiety, self-blame, as Elizabeth had mentioned earlier, anger. We might experience shame about what happened, difficulty sleeping, PTSD, which is short for post-traumatic stress disorder. We might have difficulty with close relationships. And all of those things are, of course, going to impact the way that somebody is going to communicate. And as you all know, you have superpowers. As interpreters, you have really great cognitive skills around interpretation, right? We have a really amazing capability around focus and concentration to really focus on the person's story, regardless of all of the different noises or distractions that might be happening. There's stress in the room, right? We also have a really great recall. It's really great to be able to memorize something and store it in our cache, which is our memory bank, essentially. We have a really large cache where we can store a lot of information all at once, but we also have a really good way, a really good capability of recalling, of pulling information from that memory bank. And we're doing this as we're multitasking. Maybe we're taking notes. Maybe we're listening to the message at the same time as we're interpreting if we're simultaneous interpreters, which is what especially sign language interpreters are going to be doing. And so we're splitting our focus at that same time, which is a superpower. I really do want to say just one person playing this role is enough. It is cognitively taxing as it is, right? And we're also making those really quick decisions around word choice, around, ooh, this is maybe an uncomfortable situation. I need to make a decision about what to do right now. And it is also an emotional process. We have to have the capacity to convey emotion without mimicking the person, right? There's a very fine line of interpreting with the intent of the message, right? Without necessarily mimicking, and that goes for, right? We don't copy someone's body language. We could offend somebody. We could agitate somebody by doing that. The service provider should be able to see what that person is doing. They can also hear if that person is crying, if they are upset, right? We of course don't want to have a flat affect as we're interpreting something that is very emotionally charged, but we do want to be very careful about not mimicking somebody, right? So that is a capacity or a skill that we have to develop as interpreters, and that means that there is an emotional process that we have to be prepared to go through. We should also have the capacity to maintain personal emotions separate. We're human beings. We're hearing very hard stories. We're seeing someone suffer, and of course, we're going to have emotions about it, but it has to be separate than that of your interpreting process. We have to protect our accuracy and our integrity throughout the process, so we don't get in the way of the person telling their story and getting the help that they need. We also need to have the ability to stay neutral and impartial, right? Again, it's very normal to feel hurt or angry about what this person is going through, but that neutrality and impartiality is really going to protect that person's capacity to speak for themselves. And we don't want to become an extension of the power and control wheel by taking over the conversation, by trying to help, by filling in gaps or cleaning up the message or whatever it is, right? And it is also a physical process. We, of course, have to be able to hear clearly. We have to be able to speak loudly, clearly. We have to have good diction, stay hydrated. We might be standing for long periods at a time. And we have to be careful about our microphone, et cetera, right? So there are a lot of things that we're juggling all at once. And of course, stress and triggers are going to risk our own memory and thus accuracy, right? We might go under stress, we might be triggered by the conversation. And so the same thing applies when we talk about the hippocampus going offline, the memory bank being maybe not filing away memories accurately. We have to be prepared for these environments to be as stable as possible in these intense emotions and topics as they're being discussed, right? And so we might be stressed by unknown terms. We might say, oh, I don't know this word. Or there actually are words that we don't have in this language. There's not a nice, neat equivalent. I did see a question about that in the chat, and I do want to address it more so as we're talking about what to do before, during, and after an appointment. But I guess a tip that I would like to just short and sweet give you is that I really like to prepare beforehand and get as much information about the session as possible, which means that I might be able to flag some of those words. For example, I was working with an advocate a few years ago, and she wanted to talk to her client about working through her triggers when she is triggered, right? So before the appointment, I asked her, hey, do you have any documents you'll be going over? Do you have any information to give me about what you'll be talking about, without giving me confidential information? And she sent me some infographics about triggers that she wanted to share with the survivor. And I brought up, I have a concern because in my working language, there is no neat equivalent of trigger. And so I think you can do with that what you will. Maybe this is an opportunity to really define what trigger means to you, and I will interpret what you say about what it means, what trigger means. And so you can be on the same page about what we mean by that word trigger, right? So that is maybe one tip. We really just prepare beforehand. That's a lot of what trauma-informed interpretation is about, is preparing beforehand. We might have to be interpreting obscenities, which causes us stress, maybe triggers us. We have to interpret names of body parts or sexual acts. We might have had a similar experience, so we get triggered. We have unresolved past trauma. You might be a refugee, interpreting for a refugee. And of course, there are other stressors and pressures in life. And as the interpreter, you are, again, intimately working with this message. Even if the message is happy, the trauma that we're talking about is going to add to the complexity, right? So as we're interpreting, we do what is called decoding and encoding, and I'm sure some of you are very familiar with what that is. And that just means that we're listening to a message in one language, we're stripping it of its code, which is the language, and then we're extracting the meaning, because we interpret meaning for meaning, and then we attach another message onto it. I mean, not another message, another language onto that message or that meaning. And that's what encoding means. And so in that process, we're handling the message up to 4 times, which is more than everybody else in the room. So again, this goes to show that even if we're talking about something happy or something neutral, right? Interpretation is already really cognitively taxing, as we had mentioned earlier. We're doing the split focus, we're using our memory, etc., to stay accurate. But then you add on the complexity that trauma brings, right? And it makes the job that much more taxing, right? We have a very complex role. And so what are challenges for interpreters then? We interact with ambiguous or hyper-expressive communication. Elizabeth already went over how somebody might be reluctant to share all of the information, or it may be ambiguous because we're getting there, but the information is not complete just yet. Or this might be the first time that someone has been asked, hey, what happened? Or what has been happening? It's the first time there's an interpreter in the room. It's the first time someone in their language has asked them. And so this is the time where everything is being told, right? And it's hard to take those pauses, right? And that's something that we have to be prepared for, whether it is to interpret long speech or long moments of speech at a time, or to ask, right, politely for those pauses, and to really lean on folks like Elizabeth to also cue in on that and say, hey, I want to listen to everything that you say. Do you mind if we take more pauses, right? So that the interpreter can interpret and I can hear what you just said. And so again, equitable communication means that it is everybody's responsibility to make sure that interpretation is happening. We obviously might be watching the victim or the survivor continue to be unsafe or continue to suffer. As Elizabeth said, that one phone call is maybe not going to solve all of their problems, right? And so it is hard to stay neutral and accurate when you know that is happening, but it is something that we need to be prepared for. This might be the one conversation of many to stabilize that person's life. And oftentimes, because bilingual folks are seen as the interpreter and the advocate and the emotional support and the anthropologist, right, the cultural expert, right? Oftentimes interpreters then are seen as that same thing of wearing multiple hats. And a lot of folks don't understand that we have a very specific role to play, and there are reasons that our parameters exist, right? So we might be asked, hey, can you help this person fill out this form? When we are not trained on how to fill out that form, we might be asked, to just stay here with the survivor and maybe help them navigate some other situation or to provide that emotional support. And we're really not there for those things, right? And so we have to be prepared to respond ethically when we're asked to step outside of our scope. We also might witness staff burnout and a lack of culturally relevant resources, right? It is very normal, it is very common for staff in this field to have that compassion fatigue, to go through and hear so much about people suffering and really hard situations, that the compassion part of you might become tired. And that is what compassion fatigue is. And so that might overlap with the lack of culturally relevant resources, which is very prevalent, right? That is something we come across a lot, especially for as the more the less the language is spoken in a country or a region, the less the resources are, right? That is a reality of the situation. And so we might become frustrated with the lack of resources or support, or maybe even empathy for the person's situation. As the interpreter, it is hard to witness that. And we're also obviously, right, again and again, this is a very obvious part of our job as we are interpreting in this field, is that we are interacting with highly traumatic and graphic content, and we need to be prepared to interpret words or descriptions of violence. And that is actually very hard as well. That is a challenge we need to be prepared to face. And so next, I'm going to be showing you a video that kind of highlights why term choice matters, right? Why accuracy matters. And so a little bit of a content warning. There is mention of sexual assault, and it is a little bit of an older video. It's very possible a lot of you have seen it. So my apologies if you have, but it is a bit of a classic, and I think it really shows the importance of just being prepared for this challenge. And so if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to put this video on.
Now, Mr. Mohammadi, we come to the incident itself, the sexual assault.
خب حالا آقای محمدی رسیدیم به خود حادثه آزار و اذیت جنسی.
Now, you say that you witnessed the whole event from your vantage point against the kitchen wall and that you saw and heard everything despite your own considerable injuries.
شما میگید که از دیدگاه خودتون در حالی که به دیوار آشپزخونه تکیه داده بودید، علیرغم جراحات قابل ملاحظه‌ای که داشتید، همه چیز رو دیدید و شنیدید.
بله درسته. من همه چیز رو به خاطر میارم. انگار همین دیروز بود. هرگز فراموش نمی‌کنم.
Yes, that's correct. I remember everything like it was yesterday. I will never forget.
Now, you stated earlier that the accused turned his attention back to Mrs. Mohammadi after he'd incapacitated you. What did he do? What was the next thing that he did?
شما قبلا اظهار کردید که متهم بعد از اینکه شما را از پای درآورد، توجهش رو دوباره معطوف به خانم محمدی کرد. خب اون چیکار کرد؟ اقدام بعدیش چی بود؟
ایشون خانم رو رو زمین پرت کرد و بهش تجاوز جنسی نمود.
He threw my wife to the floor and, oh God, he was disrespectful to her.
Could you be a little more specific?
ممکنه کمی بیشتر توضیح بدید؟
چی میخوایم بگم؟ بهش تجاوز کرد.
What do you want me to say? He was disrespectful to her body.
In what way was he disrespectful to her body?
به چه شکلی به بدن خانم بی‌حرمتی کرد؟
مگه 2 دفعه بهتون نگفتم؟
Have I not told you twice?
Let's try again. Mr. Mohammadi, did the accused in any way interfere with your wife's clothing?
دوباره سعی می‌کنیم آقای محمدی. آیا به هیچ شکلی متهم کاری با لباس خانمتون کرد؟
بله، ایشون دامن و شورتشو پاره کرد و بلوزشو چاک کرد.
Yes, he tore off her skirt and her panties and ripped open her blouse.
And what did he do next? Did he put his penis in her vagina?
بعدش چیکار کرد؟ چیزشو گذاشت اونجا؟
مقصودتون چیه؟ بله فکر میکنم.
What do you mean? I think so, yes.
I'm not sure I understand. Did he fully introduce his penis into her vagina?
مطمئن نیستم درست فهمیده باشم. آیا کاملا اون کاری رو که میخواست کرد؟
هر کاری که میخواست کرد.
Everything he wanted to do.
Everything he wanted to do. Well, in the course of doing everything he wanted to do, did he ejaculate?
وقتی که داشت هر کاری که میخواست میکرد، کار رو تموم کرد؟
این چه سوالیه؟ هر کسی تموم میکنه.
What kind of question is that? Everyone finishes.
Okay, so I'll stop it there. There are a couple more minutes in that video, but I do want to see reactions. What happened and what did the interpreter do? How are you all feeling about what just went down, right? How did the witness or survivor react or feel? How did the lawyer react to the interpreter's decisions or actions? And what are the consequences? Love to hear from you all. Makes me angry, says Roxana. She didn't interpret completely or accurately, right? The interpreter did not use the exact words. She violated the code of ethics. Yep. She was uncomfortable. She was bashful and didn't feel comfortable saying what happened. That changed the narrative. The interpreter seemed to want to clean up the message or clean up the language. The interpreter's lack of accuracy made the witness and lawyer angry and escalated. She was shy. She didn't interpret accurately. She seemed uncomfortable. She tried to modify the answer. She caused more troubles than help. Yeah. She interfered, and what occurred was not communicated clearly because she was uncomfortable. The man's rights were not respected. Yes. There was misinterpretation, therefore the narrative was changed. The answer from the witness was different. Right. Exactly. So the interpreter's actions were to clean up the message. She was uncomfortable describing graphic information, sexual acts. And so she changed the message for her own sake, for her own comfort. And that means that her lack of accuracy changed the perception, impacted the perception of the witness. It impacted the perception of the situation of the violent act. And thus it's going to have consequences on his and his wife's case, right? And so that's ultimately maybe going to have impacts on their sense of safety, their sense of trust in getting help or reaching out for help, et cetera. And maybe even it might impact the survivor's ability to trust in other interpreters. And of course, the lawyer could have jumped in. He could have asked, hey, is everything being interpreted correctly? There are many reasons that an answer to a question might not be coherent to the question, right? But we do want to also name that, yes, the lawyer just spent a lot of time preparing this case, spent a lot of time with these survivors trying to prepare them. And then this one element of having interpretation in the room risked the outcome of the case, right? And so her actions concealed violence. They obscured and mitigated the perpetrator's responsibility. And maybe even at the end of the day, it's going to blame or pathologize the victim. And so again, she is an extension of the power and control wheel that we went over earlier today. And so I'll go back into my slides. All right, and so at the end of the video, they interview the interpreter and she says, well, I am a lady, and in my culture, ladies do not use these words. They do not say these things. And so next we're going to talk about culture. Culture is another thing, another element that is going to impact the way one communicates, how one tells their story, understands their story, right? But it is never a reason for an interpreter to intrude or to change the message or to interfere with the conversation. And it often is used to justify just doing that, the interruption, right? And I did see in the chat that sometimes in medical interpretation, the Code of Ethics says that advocacy might be necessary if someone's life or safety is at risk or their health, right? And that is all in well. In the medical field, there is a very different Code of Ethics than that in legal or in victim services. And here we're really distinguishing those two roles. The interpreter does not advocate, and that is our Code of Ethics as one is performing trauma-informed interpretation in victim services, okay? And so some common cultural issues that might come up. There are cultural equivalents that are baseline of what we are rendering, and other manifestations of culture which affects the way we communicate or what we communicate. There are cultural considerations that impact both the technical and relational aspects of interpretation. And some examples that might arise is that in certain cultures, making direct eye contact may be considered disrespectful. There are cultural norms that restrict individuals from openly discussing their experiences, leading to ambiguity in communication. There might be victim blaming and shaming that might be prevalent in some cultures, which causes individuals or survivors to internalize these attitudes. As Nusrat had also mentioned earlier, right? The domestic violence might be seen as obedience, right? And so speaking up about what you're going through or being against that might have ripple effects in your community in a social manner, right? And while cultural issues of shame and silence affect survivors who do not need interpreters, right? This is already an element that exists without the issue of language. The cultural obstacle often increases or becomes more complex in cases that require interpretation. And considering that there are layers to a person's experience in trauma, we also want to take into account the triple trauma paradigm, which Nusrat also already kind of went over, and in other words, right? This is just one way of kind of understanding the fact that, especially for migrants, for refugees, or asylees, there are often, right, not always, but there are often circumstances that were already traumatic that cause the person to uproot, or their family to uproot and leave a situation, right? There might have been traumatic circumstances that might have been fear of unexpected arrest, or there are societal chaos or breakdown, etc., that might have caused someone to take that really drastic decision of uprooting their entire life, that of their entire family, and moving somewhere else, or migrating or fleeing somewhere else. And so there is trauma possibly already there, right? And then there's the flight, the actual journey into another country in of itself might have had elements of being separated from your family, not having access to basic needs. That in of itself might have been traumatic or had elements that are traumatic. And then post-flight, once you get to the new country, there are traumatic elements there too, right? There might be unmet expectations. You might hear bad news from home, but you're still separated from family. You still don't really have access to basic needs because of your documentation status, which is a cause for uncertainty, et cetera, right? And so this is really just to name that there are circumstances that might lead to someone's vulnerability, that circumstances that lead to the possibility for violence to occur. And so this might affect the way that one tells their story, their perceptions of their situation, their rights, etc., right? But we also want to name that culture does not just belong to the person who was not born in this country, who speaks a different language, who has that is not from this land, right? There is also a culture that is associated with victim services, law enforcement. The judicial system has its own culture. If we think about culture as a set of values and practices that are aligned with those values, right? And so a lawyer's office, a lawyer is not going to act or practice similar traditions or practices the same way that that lawyer would in their office versus at their friend's birthday party, right? Or in a judge's courtroom, you're not going to act the same way as you would with your friend or at the dentist's office. They all have their own culture, and that's also going to affect the way that one communicates, right? And so that is just to go into the high and low context cultural spectrum as well. We're going to get a little bit technical, but I think you all have already experienced this, and this is just one way of talking about how the way that we talk across cultures and across groups, even in the same culture or in the same nationality, this is really not to stereotype by any means, right? We might have different levels of shared implied meaning. So the high and low context cultural spectrum is a tool used by anthropologists and linguists to talk about how in different groups of speakers, we might have different levels of shared meaning. And so in lower context cultures or lower context settings, communication might be more explicit because we have a lower level of shared meaning. right? And so if I want you to understand the word red, I have to say red, or pink. I want you to understand pink, I'm going to use the word pink, right? And in the US, in the legal system especially, right, which is different from other settings, in the legal system, a lawyer wants to build you a really good case by getting information that is really detailed, that is very explicit, and that is in a nice linear timeline, right? And so that is going to affect the way that a lawyer asks questions, the way that they expect responses, the way that they're going to put together their case, right? And so that might be different from someone or a setting that is higher in context. There are groups of individuals, there are settings that have higher levels of shared context or meaning. And so not everything needs to be said explicitly. There are layers to how someone speaks. And maybe it's not as linear, as detailed, as explicit, right? And so this is definitely more so in those more collective cultures, in those collective settings, where there also is a lot of indirect communication, right? And I hope that this makes sense. So for an example, right, a lawyer might ask something like, ma'am, did you get into the car at 10 p.m. on Saturday? And the client might answer by talking about something that happened on Tuesday, right? And so the lawyer might look at you and think maybe you misinterpreted, maybe something's wrong with your interpretation. The interpreter might feel kind of threatened in their perception, etc. But this is actually also a very normal thing that happens. We might be getting to Saturday, right? We might be getting there. There might be layers to the communication that maybe it's not just linguistic, but it's also cultural. And so it is not up to the interpreter to perform cultural brokering, right? To clean up the message, right? Because we risk being wrong, taking a side in the conversation, taking over the conversation, or losing trust or misplacing that trust. And then the client doesn't receive the appropriate services. So this might mean that Elizabeth is privy to the fact that, right, we might not get all of the information at once. She's prepared to repeat herself. She's prepared to ask this question more than once and help piece things together. And a lawyer should too, right? That's also up to the lawyer to do. It is never for the interpreter to explain. It is for the speakers to explain for themselves. That is what part of accuracy is. It is that the interpreter is not an explainer. It is the speakers. And so again, this is just to reiterate that interpreters are not mediators, and we're much less cultural mediators, right? The speakers are the expert of their own culture and their own experience. We're likely not from the same age, class, educational background, same level of assimilation, etc. Everyone is culturally complex and unique. We all have biases as well that we might project onto the speaker. And survivors are, again, the expert of their own experience. And there are a lot of complicated things when it comes to stigma and shame. And service providers have their own culture as well, as we had mentioned. So again, constructing the narrative is not for us to do. We do not change the message for coherence, even if like the communication, not the language, but the communication is culturally distinct. There are elements of trauma that affect memory recall that make it hard to have that nice linear recalling of events. Or it might be the first time that someone has spoken about what happened. And so all the details are coming out all at once. Or maybe they're very quiet because it's not necessarily something they're comfortable talking about yet, right? There are a lot of different things that are going to affect communication, not just on the LEP individual side, but on the service provider side as well. They might want technical details. They might have a very sequential inquiry of how they want to put together their information. They might be going through compassion fatigue, which I mentioned earlier, and they might also be lacking those cultural resources. And though that is all maybe going to complicate the communication, and it might cause a lot of confusion, but that is beyond the scope of the linguistic level, right? The interpreter does not change the message for coherence. It is up to us to be aware that these are maybe elements that are going to affect the way one approaches communication, but the interpreter is never there to explain on someone's behalf. And if we need to clarify, that is its own separate thing, and that is for accuracy's sake. And constructing a narrative is part of the healing journey. That is something that I learned in my own witnessing of advocacy training, right? Is that the person might not have their story nicely figured out, or they're still processing what happened to them. And so that constructing of a narrative and being able to talk about what happened to you is not going to be nice and neat. And we as interpreters we have the honor of coming in some of those moments where that is happening, that is in process. And it is part of the healing journey. We don't want to take it over, okay? And so this is just a reminder of your code of ethics and the challenges for an interpreter in this field. Again, interpreter code of ethics vary by field, and I do understand that the medical field has a little bit of a different definition of the line between interpreter and advocacy. But when we're talking about the guiding principles for interpreters in the DBSA field, we're really kind of sticking to the legal code of ethics where we're collaborating with advocates. We're not playing the role of an advocate. And we're only interpreters. And so again, just want to remind you of your challenges as an interpreter. These are things that you might have to be prepared to interpret for. Okay, so next we're going to do a little exercise. We're going to put a few questions up on your screen to see when an interruption might be necessary. So first scenario says, you're pretty sure the survivor has no idea what the social worker is asking her to do. What kind of clarification or interruption do these require? Does it need a linguistic, or does it need clarification, cultural or linguistic misunderstanding? Do you have to remind the client or provider of your role? Do you have to correct the interpreter mistake? Or do you have to advocate for working conditions, or none of the above? That's just the first scenario. I'll keep an eye on the poll, see how y'all are doing. So we're going to answer all of these scenarios before we debrief on them. So I'll go ahead and ask you to answer what you would do or what is appropriate in each scenario. Second scenario is during a child forensic interview, the child says, we were playing, insert unfamiliar word that you've never heard, until it was time for dinner. Which clarification or interruption does this require? A caller on the DV hotline is talking to a local shelter advocate. The advocate asks for her date of birth. You, the interpreter, mistakenly say July instead of June, which is what the client said. Number 4, while you are interpreting, the survivor makes a reference to deserving the beating because she went out without her partner and therefore neglected the children. You, the interpreter, are aware that the belief of deserving a beating is prevalent among the survivors community, and that the provider's belief is in exact opposition.
The poll will be up for 20 more seconds, 15 more seconds.
Okay. So if you guys could go ahead and just let us know what kind of clarification or interruption does this require?
Ending the poll in 3, 2, 1.
Thank you, Swati. Okay, so let's look at our results. You're pretty sure the survivor has no idea what the social worker is asking her to do. Do we need clarification, cultural linguistic misunderstanding, remind the client provider of your role, correct interpreter mistake, advocate for working conditions, or none of the above? So 19% of you answered none of the above, and that would be the correct answer. If you need a clarification, it is if you do not understand something and you don't want to make assumptions. As Elizabeth had mentioned earlier, right? It is okay if you missed a word or did not understand something. You don't want to assume what that meant, right? But if the survivor is confused, because rightfully so, the legal system or the advocacy system can be confusing even if you speak the same language, that is for Elizabeth to explain. That is for Elizabeth to pause and say, actually, let me just make sure that we're understanding that we're on the same page, not for the interpreter, right? We have that the survivor, or that the provider is trained in looking out for those signs and understanding that it is not easy to understand some of these services or systems, right? And during a child forensic interview, the child says, we were playing X word which you do not understand until it was time for dinner. What kind of clarification or interruption does this require? Right, so you need a clarification, and correct, that's what 76% of you had answered. You don't understand this word and you don't want to assume what that word means. And so as interpreters, we have skills, we have training around clarifying a word and asking for that transparently. We never have a conversation with the survivor or with one of the speakers. We conduct what is called a linguistic clarification, correct? And that is a reason that we might want to interrupt. Whereas the first example, that is not a reason to interrupt a conversation, right? As long as communication is flowing, we do not interrupt. A caller on the DV hotline is talking to a local shelter advocate, and the advocate asks for a date of birth. You accidentally say June instead of July. Or you say July instead of June. And so, right, there is a reason here to interrupt. You have to interpret you have to correct your mistake, right? Because we want to protect accuracy, and transparency is key, right? This is actually going to build trust, as Elizabeth has said. One really respects when someone is able to say, actually, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I just need to correct it just so it's just so everything is accurate, right? And that is completely okay. What we do is we conduct an interruption to correct an interpreter mistake. That is an appropriate time to conduct an interruption. Of course, we want to stay as accurate as possible and avoid those mistakes, but it does happen. And last one, you are interpreting and the survivor makes a reference to deserving the beating, and you are aware that this is a prevalent belief among survivors community, and you think or you assume, right, that the provider's belief is in the exact opposition, right? So 63% of you answered none of the above, and that is correct. Someone like Elizabeth, someone like a service provider who is helping someone through a situation like this, is very aware that there might be feelings of shame, of internalized stigma, right? That the service provider is there to help them through. And the Elizabeth beautifully put that she's there to help reframe, right? She's there to provide abuse education. The interpreter can rely on folks, beautiful advocates just like Elizabeth, who are prepared to do that job, who are prepared to explain and to have that conversation with the survivor. That is not for you to interrupt and intervene and take over, right? The only time that it is appropriate to interrupt a conversation as an interpreter, especially in this field, is when you need a clarification and you don't want to assume, when you need to remind the client or provider of your role, right? Because often people think, oh, well, you're also the cultural expert and you're also the bilingual advocate. No, you're there as the interpreter, and you might have to remind people of that sometimes. You might have to correct your own mistakes, or you might have to advocate for working conditions. You might be on a phone call. I cannot hear, and so I cannot interpret. Can you step closer to the phone, etc.? We have to advocate for those working conditions. That's the only other reason to interrupt a conversation. Otherwise, we are there interpreting accurately and completely so that everybody can negotiate their miscommunications or their misunderstandings amongst themselves. And I hope that is very clear. And so again, we are back to decisions. As interpreters, we are decision makers, but the moment we make a decision on someone's behalf and not about word choice or judgment calls, we're taking that decision away from them. And we also want to think, right, what could be done on an organizational level, a community level, or a global level? We have our own spheres of influence. If we think that there's something that is problematic or something that could be helped, right, with our experience, right, without giving confidential information, maybe the experience that we have as interpreters witnessing the lack of cultural resources, witnessing that maybe there's compassion fatigue, maybe really inappropriate behavior among maybe the staff at the organization you're working for. There are other ways outside of the session when you are off the mic as an interpreter to maybe advocate for better conditions, but it is not for you to do while you have your interpreter hat on, not while you are in the session, right? That is something that I can definitely attest to. I had a lot of experiences as an interpreter, and now I am here talking to you all about better working conditions, but also advocating for yourselves, talking to people like Elizabeth and saying, hey, do you mind asking for more pauses so that I can interpret better, or really relying on her beforehand or afterwards debriefing just to get on the same page about what are the better working conditions, right? And next, we're going to go into healing-centered interpreting. But again, we will take a short break because I know that we went over a lot of information just now. So again, I will put up a 5-minute timer on the screen, and I will see you in just a few minutes.
I wanna go far away where nobody knows my name. Nothing to prove, nothing to lose. Starting over, starting new anywhere but here. Anywhere but
Call it immigration, call it integration, calling all the pockets and the hottest in the nation. It was no vacation, mom and papa made it. Took a penny, turned it to a milli, now we're famous. Always be the outcast. Cut you off. You are not a token, you are not a trophy. You're a freaking gangster, everything they wanna be.
we're unstoppable, baby. That fight energy can't take it out of me.
This is the new Americana. To the hustlers working harder. That first generation raised one up singing ay ay ay. The new Americana. To the hustlers working harder. That first generation raised one up singing ay ay ay.
All right, we are approaching the last few seconds of our second and last 5-minute break. I hope you all were able to do what you needed to do to take care of yourselves. So next we will be talking about healing-centered interpreting. And this is something we've been alluding to throughout the entire training today. And I do apologize for how short the poll was earlier. We do have a lot of information, as I had said earlier. Hopefully it is an activity that just gets you started in thinking about these scenarios and these moments, right? And again, I do want to reiterate, yes, there is a difference between the medical interpretation code of ethics, and that exists for a reason, right? Those are life-saving services. There are very specific circumstances that advocacy might be needed. But we are talking about the guiding principles today and the code of ethics that has to do with really distinguishing the role, because that is also actually a life-saving service, is by really understanding that the interpreter's role is not that of an advocate. And so this is really just to get you all thinking and to apply it as it is appropriate for you in your field. Okay. And so healing-centered interpreting. We want to recognize the impact of power dynamics on everyone present, right? Interpretation is for everyone. As Nusrat mentioned in the beginning, language is power. We do wield a power dynamic as bilingual folks, right? As interpreters who can navigate more than one culture. That there is power that we're wielding, and we want to be really careful about not being an extension of the power and control wheel, and maybe taking control of the situation, using our own power to maybe speak on someone's behalf and enabling silence or perpetuating that dependency, or even re-victimizing the survivor. We also want to be able to understand the impact of trauma on language and decision-making in order to center the client's needs and preferences without sacrificing what we as interpreters need to do a good job. And we also want to uplift the client's agency. Agency is a key word, right? We want everyone to be able to speak on their own behalf, make their own decisions, and that is all for the goal of safety and empowerment, right? So I will remind you of the core elements of trauma-informed interpretation. We want to keep in mind safety. We want to create a safe environment for communication, and that is going to be directly correlated with someone's ability to communicate. We want to empower the survivor. We want to empower the survivor to make their own decisions, to make choice and have agency in what they do and how they speak even, right? That goes down all the way down to how they are able to participate in the conversation, right? And that is not something we take lightly. We are also informed by an understanding of trauma and healing. We want to recognize how trauma may impact communication and behavior, and we want to approach interpretation with knowledge of those trauma responses, just to psychologically prepare and to maintain our accuracy throughout. And we also want to center the communicative autonomy of the survivor, which means we want to ensure that the survivor can communicate in their own voice, despite language differences, and to preserve the message without altering its intent or content. And we want to respect role boundaries and avoid speaking on behalf of the survivor, right? We really are becoming an extension of the power control wheel by doing that. We are helping by just interpreting, right? And we want to be able to foster a person's ability to communicate in their own voice, right? We want to enable equitable communication. Again, that model of communication in which everyone impacted by an issue has the right to participate in addressing it. And the survivor is the expert on their own culture. Service providers have the responsibility to go through training, to go through trauma-informed cultural competency training, right? The interpreter is not always going to be there to fill in those gaps. And it is wonderful folks as Elizabeth and folks at DIA who provide those culturally specific services, but also it is the responsibility of those mainstream or maybe monolingual English speaking organizations to take that responsibility and say, I might need training on how to perform services in a culturally responsive manner, right? And that is a process, and we want to hold service providers accountable in that process by also respecting our own role as interpreters. We might think that, you know, all of this weighs on us, our shoulders as interpreters, as the folks who can see everything that's happening, the implications, but really there are many decisions that are coming before you even enter the room and afterwards as well, after you leave the room, okay? And so you can advocate for language access, which means advocating also for service providers to go through that cultural competency training to understand when it's appropriate or when it's necessary to ask for clarification themselves and to really be able to work with folks who are from different cultures, right? And do remember the interpreter's role. One of our guiding principles is the scope of practice. We honor the message and we do not explain it. We respect our own boundaries. We're the voice, right? We become the voice for the victim and avoid helping, right? We might think we're helping, but we might actually be undermining the person's safety and their agency. We're trained and qualified to interpret, not to provide emotional support, advocacy, cultural education, etc. And so I will remind you here of the guiding principles for interpreters working outside of the courtroom in DVSA settings. We of course know that the courtroom is going to have its own code of ethics. The medical office is going to have its own code of ethics. And we're talking about the guiding principles for interpreters working with DVSA victims and their providers, right? And so again, we have a duty to accuracy. We are never there to explain for the victim. The speakers explain for themselves. It is never up to us to explain. It is not about what I, Tomiko, think that you should say or what I think it is appropriate. It is about what the speakers say, right? And we have a duty to integrity as well. So we have to really assess before we take on an assignment. Am I the right person for this one? Am I going to be able to accurately and completely interpret the content of this assignment that has to do with maybe sexual assault or child sexual abuse even, right? We have to be honest about our own triggers and what is going to risk our ability to say accurate, right? We have to be prepared to interpret vocabulary and descriptions of violence. We cannot sterilize language for a false sense of decency. And we have to recuse ourselves and say, listen, I have, hopefully you have a colleague that you can pass the assignment on to and say, I can't take this one on, but hopefully my colleague is available. And of course, we have to be honest about our qualifications. We cannot say that we are certified when we have gone through a training program that gives us a certificate, etc. We also have a duty to impartiality. We have no stakes in the outcome. We are not there for or against either party. The message is our client, right? And that also goes for our demeanor. We cannot show bias or partiality through our facial expressions, by our body language, right? That is going to make other people uncomfortable, and that actually might also impact the perception of the speaker. And of course, professionalism. We have to be up to date on our code of ethics and how to dress, etc. for all of these settings, where to sit, etc. Right? And we also have to maintain a professional relationship with the survivor. It might be tempting to perform a relationship with the survivor who is very isolated. That is very common, right? Especially for folks who are from different cultures who maybe don't speak the language in the country, right? But we really are just interpreting and maintaining that professional relationship. We then become a proponent of their agency and their healing. Of course, confidentiality is number one in this field. None of the information that we hear in the room is going to leave the room, right? And that also means if we live in a community where there aren't very many speakers of that language, and you see the survivor or the speaker out in public, that means you do not wave at them and say, hi, oh, I saw you at that appointment where I interpreted for your situation of domestic violence, right? We do not, we keep our relationship completely confidential and professional. We also want to center consent, of course, right? As folks who work in this field, that's what Elizabeth centers in her conversations. She follows up with, is that okay, right? We want to also think about consent. Are we speaking on someone's behalf without their consent? Are we taking liberties with someone's message because of what we think or what we feel, right? We have to keep consent in mind. And we also have to stay within our scope of practice. We're not the Uber driver. We're not the lawyer. We're not the therapist. We are there to interpret. That's what we have training to do. We also have the duty to report impediments to performance, whether that's physical, right? I cannot hear because the air conditioner is too loud and I'm sitting right next to it. Can we move, right? I want to protect my accuracy. And that could also be linguistic. Actually, we speak the same language, but from different regions. And so I actually need a clarification on that term because I've never heard it before and I don't want to make assumptions, right? We have skills around swift clarification if there's a linguistic element that you're not understanding. And of course, personal as well. We do not get we do not go into sessions where we know that maybe our accuracy is at risk, and that has a lot to do with the integrity that we talked about. Ethical violations, we of course have the duty and the obligation to report them, right? If someone is asking you to do something that is maybe against your code of ethics or maybe even unlawful, right? Or expects that of you, that is something that you can report to somebody. And of course, we're always staying up to date with professional development, with the field, etc. So our last note, we'll be talking about interpreter vicarious trauma and self-care. What is vicarious trauma? Who is affected by it? As we are interpreting for situations that are very heavy, right, that have trauma implications, right, we might be taking in some of the emotional consequences, their emotional and psychological impacts, physical symptoms, interpersonal conflicts at work, etc. Right? We accumulate vicarious trauma. Vicarious meaning indirect. You're not the person who experienced the traumatic effect, but you're hearing about these things, and so there are going to be repercussions that that accumulate for you, right? This might also change your perception of the world. You might have a heightened sense of vulnerability or an extreme sense of helplessness, right? This is something that accumulates over time and is not from one day to another. And I will remind you that as folks who are handling the message very intimately, this is a huge risk, right? Because we're interpreting things in first person, never in third person, unless it is an absolute need and there are no other options, right? This is especially for those emergency rooms. Or if we're interpreting for someone who is maybe an elder or a child who is getting confused by the first person, or if interpreting something in the first person is actually causing a traumatic symptom for you as well, right? But we always interpret in first person, which might mean that, you know, you are saying, I went through this horrible situation, and that might mean that we are internalizing some of what happened, right? And we're repeating, hearing, processing again and again, and so we are the messenger of a meaning that is really hard to even talk about. We also, a lot of the times, I think we use visualization for memory, which means that it gets really hard to not think about these things, right? And we have to be really careful about visualizing some of this graphic information. We have a duty of confidentiality. We cannot really talk about what happened to other people, right? You might be hearing this day in and day out, and there's little to no debrief opportunity, right? So you can't really talk to the person, maybe the advocate, right? Maybe I might debrief with with Elizabeth about what just happened, right? Because it stays confidential. But sometimes that is an opportunity, but it's not necessarily something that's very common. So self-care is self-awareness, a huge, a key capacity for an interpreter or capability is to self-assess, to be self-aware. That's really what has to do with integrity as well, to really check yourself and say, do I have the capacity to be accurate and complete and not be affected by this appointment, right? We have to have a regular self-assessment and prevent versus treat those symptoms, just like any other anything else that would affect your health. And hopefully you have resources in your workplace, which again means that you are able to debrief with someone like Elizabeth, right, about the conversation, even if it's not necessarily to talk about the exact contents of the conversation, just to talk about, hey, what went well? Do you have any feedback for me, et cetera, et cetera. It just helps to kind of provide closure, right? And we also need to have a personal system of reconnecting and transitioning from the appointment, right? We have to be able to really know ourselves and reconnect with that version of ourselves when we take off our interpreter hat and leave the content of the conversation where it was had, right? And so some tips. Before you go into a session, consider briefing. So I did see in the chat, right, it's very uncommon that you will have access to information. And so I do encourage you as much as you can to advocate for those working conditions where you do have information as much as possible beforehand. Hey, you know, when you see a request for an appointment come in, contact the service provider or contact the requester and say, hey, do you have any documents that you'll go over, or can you tell me about any of the themes that you'll be going over, just so I can prepare vocabulary, but also just so I can self-assess and say, actually, yes, I'm the right fit for this role, right? I'm the right fit for this assignment. So that briefing is really connected to the ability to self-assess. If it's possible, I would really advocate for that. That I think self-advocacy is a key component of an interpreter skill set as well. We have to have a balanced lifestyle, right? The more stressed we are, the less our memory is going to be reliable for our interpreting. We also are constantly building our glossary. We have to prepare and practice, confirm number of participants, right? We can't interpret for many, many people at a time unless we are using simultaneous interpretation. It also helps to have physical objects or rituals. I know interpreters who will leave the conversation and maybe rip up their notes, right? And that is their way of closing out the session and is a way to transition from that session back to their normal life, right? And that is one ritual. Or maybe you have, I've heard of someone else who uses normally a scarf when they go into an interpreting session. That's when they have their interpreter mode on. Once the session is over, they take off that scarf, and that just helps them psychologically transition from an appointment. And have a plan for afterward. If you know that you're going to be interpreting something that is heavy, just know that you will need self-care afterwards. And during, establish trust by being accurate. The more stressed we are because we're not being accurate, the more we're going to add to the stress that's already happening in the appointment. Do introduce yourself so everybody is aware of what's going on. That is trauma-informed, to let everybody know about what to expect from you. Take breaks if it's necessary or if it's possible and appropriate, right? If you've been interpreting for an hour and a half, maybe you can say interpreter needs a bathroom break. I will be right back, right? Something like that that feels organic, natural, if it's appropriate. Obviously, you have to read the room and not take a break right when it's not when it's a dire part of the conversation, right? Or if you're really going to interrupt the flow of communication. And position yourself safely, right? Consider the safety and also consider the sense of safety of the survivor. We don't want to sit right behind them, but we don't want to sit in a triangle position where we're considered part of the conversation. Note-taking is trauma-informed. If you have not taken a training or have not been practicing note-taking, I do highly, highly recommend it. It is going to lessen the risk of us having to ask for a repetition because we didn't understand or because we don't remember parts of the message. And when that happens, when someone is speaking for longer periods at a time, we can outsource that information in our notes and really increase our cache or our memory bank, right? So it is a trauma-informed practice to take notes if you are a consecutive interpreter and you are performing oral interpretation. Advocate for yourself, like I had said, and do not panic. Stay grounded and maybe have those deep breathing exercises available. Afterwards, like I had said, debriefing is a really powerful way of staying trauma-informed and taking care of yourself as the interpreter. And that's also a way that you can self-assess, get some feedback from the service provider if it's possible, right? We can't expect it all of the time. It's not always possible, but if you can, advocate for it. And by self-assessing, you can also know yourself and have, again, a plan, right? To decompress, maybe exercise, maintain a social life and hobbies, and also find purpose in the work, right? A bigger view, a big picture view of what is happening in just your ability to provide accurate interpretation. You know that you are contributing to a change in this person's life, and you are also helping in this person's process of becoming a victim to a survivor. And hopefully that survivor is able to trust that interpreters are there to also center their voice and maybe speak at a larger scale about changing our culture away from circumstances that allow or perpetuate violence to happen, right? So find purpose in the work. That is also going to help us to integrate a lot of these elements without internalizing the vicarious trauma. So before we close out, we do have a quick poll just to revisit some of the questions that we went over at the very beginning and to see where you are now. So we'll have that poll up for a few minutes or for a couple of minutes, and then we'll go into questions and then we'll talk about CEUs. I also have a few resources to share with you from API GBB, and so I'll take a second for the polls and then go into that.
Why don't we can drop some of those resources in the chat. We have quite a few questions that maybe we can get to while this poll is up.
Good idea. I will do that now.
And I believe Chloe is providing the questions.
Tomiko, you can look at the questions and start maybe responding.
Yeah, I'm just making sure that the resources I had mentioned are in the chat. So first, you have access to the Language Access Hub at API GBB. A lot of resources there around trauma-informed interpretation for interpreters and service providers alike. We're also holding an Interpreters Corner monthly at API GBB, where we can all come together, network, and also talk about some more detailed information and share some tips and about trauma-informed interpretation, culturally specific services. And then we also have our API GBB listserv where you can keep up to date on some of our events and some of the resources that we have coming up. All right, so I will go into the Q&A now.
If you'd like, I can read you some of the questions. I think Elizabeth took the first one. But the second question was, what is your advice for situations in which the advocate is made to interpret due to a lack of trained interpreters available? So they are providing both interpretation and advocacy in that setting.
Right. So I would just remind everyone that probably what you are doing is maybe language brokering. You are lowering the language barrier, but what you are doing is not interpretation. Maybe that is where you're providing mediation summaries, but that is what you are doing as a bilingual advocate to break the language barrier, but it is not interpretation. And I would, outside of the session, when it's possible, really advocate for capacity building for interpreters and connecting them connecting them with more resources about information on what the difference is between an advocate and an interpreter. We have a ton of information on that in our Language Access Hub. And you can also let us know if you need some support. We definitely, what you are describing is not at all uncommon. And we're here to support you in advocating for language access as well.
Sometimes, oh, I just lost it. Sometimes I have had a session where the service provider is not paying attention and is just issuing questions. When the victim/survivor starts to shake or tremble, they don't see it. When they start to cry, they don't see it. We are not an advocate, but I often have to call this to the service provider's attention. These are legal settings and recorded. Can you address these?
Yeah, and that's hard. That's hard to witness and hard to see that, you know, maybe a service provider is maybe moving really fast or also has maybe that compassion fatigue. And that's possibly something that you can address after the appointment is over and saying, hey, listen, I'm noticing that your staff are not necessarily being trauma informed or really cueing or taking cues from the survivor on, you know, when they may be triggered or just not feeling good. But during the session is really not the moment to bring that up. It is, of course, uncomfortable and it's our instinct to help, but that is something to address afterwards. Consider your sphere of influence as an interpreter who is witnessing these over again and noticing a systemic problem inside of a specific institution, right? And so that's what I would have to say about that. It is really hard to witness.
Yeah. As an interpreter for, oh my goodness, I keep losing these. As an interpreter for survivors, being emotionally neutral and as an interpreter for a survivor, being emotionally neutral and do not showing empathy wouldn't be an obstacle for the survivor to talk openly about their case. I am thinking about a specific kind of case, LGBTQ plus in countries where the community is not friendly. But
okay,
I-
so
Yeah, I'm just reading them as I see them, and I don't see the question.
I
I
do
see
see
the
the question
specifics.
here. Yeah, so it says, as an interpreter for survivors being, I'm just trying to make sure I understand. As an interpreter for survivors being emotionally neutral and not showing empathy wouldn't be an obstacle for survivors to talk openly about their case. Specifically LGBTQ plus in countries where the community is not LGBTQ plus friendly, right? So I think from what I understand in this question is that it is hard to stay neutral emotionally when there are so many obstacles that exist for a survivor based on all of those overlapping identities that they have, right? Especially for those who maybe are living with a disability or are, you know, from the LGBTQ plus community, they face that many more barriers to safety or to healing because of those marginalizations, and they overlap, right? The more you have of those identities, the harder it might be to reach the services or the safety that you need. And it is hard. It definitely is hard to witness that. And again, I think that is a place where maybe we can skill up on maybe queer friendly vocabulary or language, but it really is for the service provider to train up, skill up on those identities and know how to work with those identities. It is not for the interpreter to know how the service provider should be working or how they should be handling it. Unfortunately, we do see a lot of lack of resources for different culturally specific groups, and that is a challenge for interpreters. But what we can do is skill up as interpreters and maybe bring up that concern to their supervisors or to the organization and say, hey, listen, there are really great resources around training to become more queer friendly or LGBTQ plus friendly at your organization, and then maybe pass on that information, but it does not happen during the session that you are interpreting.
I am a phone interpreter, so I do not get any information prior to the call. I have seen an increase in mental health calls dealing with abuse. Do you offer training for OPI?
Yeah, and that is really hard when you don't have information going into it. And I hope that your organization does have maybe mechanisms in place, or are thinking about putting mechanisms in place that do route certain types of calls to certain interpreters who have checked off the box and said, yes, I'm ready for this type of appointment or ready for this type of assignment. And there are a ton of resources out there around clinical interpretation, what to consider. A lot of trauma-informed interpretation on my end is definitely informed by clinical interpretation, what to consider in those mental health settings. And so definitely reach out. I will go ahead and share my screen again so that we can go through our evaluation and so that you can also see our contact information as we close out today's session. Thank you so much, everyone, for being so engaged today and for all of the thoughtful questions and comments. We will stick around for a little longer if you'd like to chat, if you have any more questions, but we do want to respect your time, and please do go through this evaluation if you're able. And we're also going to drop the link in the chat to take this evaluation. And I will also be dropping my contact information in the chat. If you would like to reach out about any assistance or just any support that you'd like regarding this topic and advocating for better working conditions, better language access practices. Okay.
Tomiko, can you please share the last slide where it has all our information, both APBI and us?
Yes.
And
go.
thank you all for attending and for your patience. A very big thank to Tomiko from API-DB and Masterword for helping with the CEUs, and Tagalog for helping with the project, Swati and Chloe for the tech support. In a few days, we will have our training recorded and on YouTube channel, and we will be sending you then an email to all the participants for attending today with the recording. Thank you so much. We will have the CEUs for you. You will be contacted by Masterword, as I just said. All the participants who need CEUs will get the CEU. Thank you again for being here today, and thank you all. Yes, you will be receiving a participation certificate as well. And if you need the CEUs, you will be able to do so from that. Thank you.
We had quite a few more questions. I don't know if we're going to keep answering questions, but I think we were on number 7 or 8.
Tomiko,
Yeah.
you want to say an answer?
We had 2 more questions to address.
Yes, I think we can respond.
Sure.
We had number 7. I have a question for interpreters who suffer in TMJ, chronic and acute TMJ job pain. As we all know, interpretation work is a stressful job. The real-time on-demand nature is really physically challenging and draining, especially if one works remotely. Health-wise, what do you advise interpreters who suffer this health condition? Thank you.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting one. TMJ, I know that can be really difficult, not just for interpreters, but really for everyone. I am not a body work professional, and so that is a hard one to answer. I think the only the first thing that comes to mind is that maybe we take breaks, or maybe we can take on assignments that we know are only going to last a certain amount of time, right? If we know that it's the type of appointment that's going to be 3 hours long, maybe we know, right, what our limitations are, what we need to take care of ourselves. And so that 3-hour appointment is not something that we should take for our own health, but also for the integrity of the appointment. And maybe that's something you can advocate for at your organization, and just let people know that is an accommodation that you need for your own health and your own body. And otherwise, in terms of, taking care of the jaw pain, I do wish I had more information about that. I do know that there are bodywork professionals that specialize in those things. And so I would definitely encourage you to reach out to them.
And the last question was, we had this come up at a recent training session, but curious how confidentiality would work for an interpreter who is also a mandatory reporter, teacher, licensed medical, social worker, etc.
That is interesting. As someone who is maybe able to perform both roles, for example, if you are a teacher who also has skills and training around interpretation, that might be the case because it's necessary, but we're never walking into the space as the teacher/interpreter, right? That does not exist. There is no such thing as being able to play both roles at once. And so when we enter a space, we have to know which hat we're putting on. Which role am I going to play in this conversation? Am I the teacher, or who maybe is breaking the language barrier? Or am I the interpreter who can only interpret the message, where the message is my client? It's not the parent or the child, it's the message. And so as an interpreter, you're interpreting everything that is being said, right? And so you would not necessarily be privy to information that otherwise the other speakers would not hear, right? Technically, if that's what's happening, if everybody is aware of what was just said, then of course also the teacher, the other professionals in the room would be aware of this information, who are also possibly mandated reporters, right? And so I would be really careful about kind of coming into a space and thinking that we can play both roles, where maybe it's just more appropriate to be the teacher, and then also just be able to perform your duties in terms of that mandated reporting and confidentiality, right? The interpreter adheres to the confidentiality rules of their organization or of the parties who are speaking to one another. And so I hope that makes sense. We like as interpreters, we are not going to be privy to information without it being interpreted already. And so hopefully you're not in a situation where it's just you and the other parties that need interpretation, and that information that compromises someone's health or safety comes out, right? You're not the only person who would be hearing that information. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Does Nusrat or Elizabeth, do you have anything to add to that?
I think you just correctly mentioned it, that interpreters should have a distinct role as an interpreter to interpret. And there can also be a conflict, right? So, and you know, I would say to all the participants, if you have any more questions, or if we did not answer to your responses that you want, please reach out to us. You have our email contacts. You can always reach out to us for any clarification or any more detailed answers or responses. We would be happy to do that. Thank you again, respecting everybody's time. We are 8 minutes over. Thank you again from wherever you have joined us. We really feel very appreciative of your patience and being here today. Thank you all. Thank you very much.